Yeah, good morning to you viewers. I'm here with you again today. We have another program sponsored by the Burnham Foundation. And today we're going to be dealing with a topic that is current. Of course, we're going to have elections update. But before we go to that, we will be expressing sincere condolences to one of our comrades, one of our warrior comrades on the YSM those days, the GYSM. The dropping out of the race of Mr. Eustace Hall, better known as Reggie Hall. And with me in the studio today is Mr. Vincent Alexander, the chairman of the Burnham Foundation. Mr. Alexander also served as the national chairman of the YSM in those days, called today the GYSM. And on behalf of all of us who are members of the Burnham Foundation, I would like to express sincere condolences to his family and other relatives and friends on his passing. And Vincent, I want to invite you at this stage to kind of reflect, say a few words in relation to this man that has gone beyond, Mr. Reggie Hall.
Thank you very much. Here we're talking about Eustace Hall, but better known as Reggie. Reggie Hall was a real stalwart of the YSM. In fact, he is one of the founder members of the PNCYO. Those who do not know, before we got to the YSM, there were young people who formed this core group called the PNCYO, and Reggie Hall was a member of that group. Reggie Hall went on to serve as national chairman, the national secretary, national treasurer of the YSM. But I think the hallmark of Reggie's life was his servitude. Reggie was someone who really worked on the ground, among the grassroots, among the youths, and was known throughout the country. Reggie could go to any village along the East Coast, quarantine, and people would know him for the leg work that he did in all of those areas, and literally did leg work. Reggie was not someone associated with driving a car or riding a motorcycle or even riding a cycle. He was associated with walking from group to group, from place to place, and being in touch with the comrades and working with the comrades. Reggie happened to have migrated in 1983, but even when he migrated, he became the epicenter of party activities in New York, and was responsible over there for the formation of the New York #1 PNC group. Reggie has now passed. I think he passed at the age of 79, and one could describe Reggie as a Burnhamite for all intents and purposes. So I think it behooves the Burnham Foundation to express its sympathy to his family, his friends, his comrades, and to indicate that, in fact, in honor of the life of Eustace Hall, better known as Reggie, we will come back with a commemorative program on this State of the Nation sometime in the very, very near future. We will invite persons who worked closely with Reggie so that we can truly celebrate Reggie's life.
I personally, I remember Reggie Hall in my time in the YSM. And of course, like you rightly said, he was a man of the ground, where he worked the ground. And what struck me about this gentleman, there was a certain degree of humbleness in relation to his work when he come to talk with you and so on. And in those days, it was a very difficult task to really mobilize and try to enthuse our young people to really get involved into his politics. And I think that the YSM then did an excellent job, because it's under the stewardship of Reggie that the YSM, and maybe an earlier executive, that the YSM really came into its mold and did a number of things in this country, really displayed leadership amongst young people. And I think that Reggie should be credited in a very large measure for those efforts and programs that were executed under the umbrella of the YSM in those days.
Yes, he has to be. Not only was he on the ground, but in the early 70s, he became a permanent fixture in the YSM secretariat. So he was the one who was actually responsible for the day-to-day operation of the YSM. And one would know that those were the glory days of the YSM, the 70s. And Reggie was at the epicenter again, I would say, of those activities in those days. He really was a stalwart. He really was someone, as you said, extremely humble. If you saw Reggie, you wouldn't know by looking at him the dynamism
That's true.
of the man. But if you got to know how he did his work, he really was someone who was committed. He never occupied some of the higher offices in this country, parliamentarian and things like that. But his work was like the pedestal upon which many of us were able to ascend as we attained higher office.
Vincent, you made a point which I need to reflect on. Reggie's ability to have contacts in all the regions anywhere he goes. There was when I was YSM, and there was a conference in Region 6 in Amsterdam, and Reggie called to tell me that, Conrad, I'll be in your area, not knowing that Reggie really intended to in those days, I was very much younger and active in YSM, and I had moved away from my parents' home and was living as a bachi, myself and another comrade who worked with the government then. We were both with the government at the time. So Reggie called us, I'll be in your area, not knowing that when Reggie is finished with all he had to do, turned up to say that he's spending the night at my house. And as a comrade, you had no right to say no. Those things, I remember.
Those are memorable days, because in fact, I became acquainted with you through Reggie.
That's right.
Because on my first visit, I must have still been in my teens, late teens. My first visit to quarantine was accompanying Reggie. Took me as far as Blackbush Polder, where we had a meeting at Let's Be Holden, or better called Zambia.
Yes.
Better called Zambia. And then we came back to New Amsterdam. And in fact, I was in his company on that evening when we descended on your home. And it was my first experience of sleeping away from home doing political work. And that was under the tutelage of Reggie Hall, you know. So there are those of us who have a debt of gratitude to Reggie Hall for the way in which he was able to show us the grapevines of political life in a very simple and a very humble way.
I heard you saying that we're going to be coming back, of course, later to do a commemorative program for Reggie, but I think he'll be buried on Monday, I think it is.
Yeah, the funeral, I think, is scheduled for Monday. But because of COVID, that's a kind of a restricted activity. I'm also advised that they're going to have a Zoom activity later in the month, in July, where people will be able to join and to give their tributes.
Okay.
So we are going to be shouting you out on when that Zoom activity will take place, and that will afford the thousands and the tens of thousands of Guyanese who came into contact, or with whom Reggie came into contact, to be able to join that program and to express their appreciation for the contribution Reggie made to the development of young people, the development of the party during his lifetime.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Alexander, for those words on Reggie Hall, my friend who has come out of the race. But our topic today is elections update. And I want to tell our viewers that I will give you some time to call in and comment, make a contribution. I have Mr. Alexander, one of the commissioners. We all know that we had elections on the 2nd of March. And since the 2nd of March, there has not been a declaration as yet. But subsequent to that elections, there were a lot of activities and issues that came up, and that issues that are being addressed as we speak. So, Vincent, I know that there was a recount which came about as a result of this kind of satisfaction from the opposition and from even from APNU themselves, and there was an agreement between the leader of the opposition and His Excellency President David Arthur Granger to have this recount to validate the elections, to make sure that the votes that are counted are credible. Now, I would like you to take us back to the origin of this whole concept of recount in subsequent to our elections and where we are at present.
Thank you very much, Clayton. Clayton, before I go to the questions of recount, I want to restate a position of the Burnham Foundation. A position not occasioned by these elections, but a position occasioned by our disposition towards the Guyana we lived in. And that is that Guyana has what I would refer to as a chronic problem. A chronic problem in terms of its governance structure, which is not inclusive of all of the groups. There's a tendency for dominance of one party or the other, parties which are to some extent reflective of a particular ethnic group and therefore of the values of that group, etc. And so for us in the Burnham Foundation, this represents a kind of sickness that our society is afflicted by, which one may say is chronic, because it's there underlying all the time. The problem between the ethnic groups, the politics that is manifest of that problem. And so when we come to election time, we really see this merely as an acute state of the sickness. You know, it's not that everything is hunky-dory in election time, suddenly there's a political upheaval. It's just that these things are latent and underlying, and they become acute at election time. And so we do not view elections as they are presently constituted as being responsive to the realities of the Ghana situation. And we do feel that there is a tremendous need in this country for a conversation at the level of the people themselves, a conversation at the political level, that will allow us to, in the first instance, identify the realities of the Guyanese society, and after that identification, to be able to propose solutions from a governance perspective. And so that whilst we are going to talk about elections, we don't see this as a conversation that is at the core of what is necessary for Ghana's development. We think that the conversation which is required is one about governance, which would include how we approach the question of elections differently, so that we do not have this ongoing antagonistic relationship among the various groups and the various parties, and rather we can come to a situation where at least we have certain values and certain principles that are embraced by all, even though different parties may be in government. Presently, we don't have that. We have a complete fracturing of things when it moves from one party to the other. We have apparent exclusion when it moves from one party to the other, and therefore this nation which we want to build continues to be but a nation state of different nations.
I like those that outline you just give, and I was looking at you and I get the impression that this is a view that you share very strongly, which you think that we should have a conversation to address these issues, so there would not be a continuation when election comes along, this acrimonious and divisive comments, attitude being displayed by people. But like I said, I wanted us to look at this question of this recount that was agreed upon by His Excellency and the leader of the opposition.
Certainly, but just let me emphasize that the Burnham Foundation has not said what I just said in response to election 2020.
Okay.
It is saying this as a principal position that predates elections, so that people shouldn't think that we are trying to support some effort of one side or the other to stay in power. We see this question as a very fundamental question that has to be addressed as a solution to the country. Anyhow, we come to the question of the recount.
The recount.
The recount. In our electoral process, there is a provision under the Representation of the People Act for a recount in any particular polling division, polling district, if a party is dissatisfied with the original count. So that's provided for in our laws. In 2020, there were a number of such requests. There was such a request in Region 2, Region 3, Region 4, Region 5, and Region 6. So there were expressions of dissatisfaction with the count by parties, not one, not two, by parties. But none of those recounts proceeded to finality. In some cases, the recounts were not approved. If I'm not mistaken, the recount in Region 4 was not approved. The recount in Region 3 was not approved. The recount in Region 5 was held in abeyance. The recount in Region 6 started, and then there was an abortion, there were some technical problems. So that these recounts, which were required and requested, and there was a lot of furore about the Region 4 recount, didn't take place. But in the face of those recounts not taking place, there was a lot of ferment arising, and there seemed to be a crisis involving in the circumstance. And in the face of that crisis, there was a meeting of minds between the leader of the opposition and the leader of the incumbent party, the president, that what we should do is to have a complete recount
Of all the regions.
Of all the regions. A complete recount of all the regions. And that we should call in CARICOM to be an observer, facilitator of that complete recount. This was initiated, and the CARICOM team, a team then of 5 persons, actually arrived to conduct that recount. But they requested that in order to ensure there were no legal problems, that there should be an order, a gazetted order, and that would be the legal foundation upon which the recount would be done. And so GCOM proceeded to work on that gazetted order. In that process, GCOM then worked with the Ministry of Legal Affairs, and more specifically the Chief Parliamentary Council, to craft the order. And in that process, and the persons involved then would have been GCOM. I think 2 commissioners were actively involved, Commissioner Gonraj and Commissioner Corbin. And if I'm not mistaken, Mr. Landelad himself also attended that forum in the attempt to craft the relevant order. What came out of that, however, was that the Chief Parliamentary Council advised that under the laws of Guyana, we could not in fact have a recount that was being done by a third party, that is CARICOM. Because that's the way that one was being fashioned, that they were the ones who were actually supervising the recount. And so that fell flat on its face.
That fell down.
Fell flat on its face. GCOM, however, went back and reviewed the situation and decided that GCOM itself would do this recount. So it would be a GCOM supervised recount rather than a CARICOM supervised recount, but that they would still, in the spirit of what had been agreed to by the leader of the opposition and the president, invite CARICOM to be active participants. And so CARICOM was re-invited, so to speak, with the capacity of a scrutinarian body rather than a mere observer to participate in the recount. And so we embarked upon a recount based on an order. An order now which was not an order saying CARICOM.
Saying GCOM.
GCOM. And that order was pretty extensive. And I think this is what has become a main area of contention. That order, notwithstanding the nomenclature of the activity being referred to as a recount, that order was not an order based on the normal recount provisions. The normal recount provisions are found in the Representation of the People's Act.
Right, okay.
In the People's Act. Representation of the People Act. And that specifies what basically a recount is. But having not had the recounts under that provision, we then went to Article 162 of the Constitution, which gives GCOM very wide powers in terms of giving instructions to get things done in particular circumstances. And in addition to Article 162, we then went to Section 22 of the Election Laws Amendment Act, which deals with removal of difficulties. So the difficulty here was that the normal recounts had already been denied, and so there was no provision in the law specifically for a recount of the nature which we were now embarking on. And so we had to use the removal of difficulty provision in tandem with 162, which gave GCOM wide powers to craft the order for the recount. And in that order, we went beyond the traditional recount. We provided for, yes, a recount of the numerical ballots in the box, but we also specified that we wanted to ensure that in the process of recounting, there was a reconciliation between the ballots cast and the number of persons who reportedly voted, and therefore it meant you would have to look at the OLE, the official OLE, and the names that were crossed off to see if that number of names crossed off corresponded with the number of ballots. We wanted to see that if there were instances where there were people who voted by proxy, that the actual proxy document was there to show they were entitled to vote. Similarly, to see if there were people who voted by certificates of employment, that they were the actual documents to show that these persons were authorized to vote. In the instance where persons did not have ID cards and presented themselves, that there was an oath of identity, and that oath of identity was in fact formalized, so you had a record of how was it those persons, so that the whole idea was in fact to conduct an exercise that is not dissimilar from an audit, but an exercise authorized under the wide provisions of Article 162 and the specific provision of the Elections Laws Amendment Act, removal of difficulties. And what was then determined was that out of the exercise there would be a tabulation of the votes, the ballots counted. But accompanying the tabulation of those ballot counts would be observation reports. And so in a sense, though you will have ballots counted, there will be some qualification of that number by virtue of the observation reports, which would speak to those numbers in relation to the issues I just raised, whether all of the documentation was available and things like that. So that's the exercise which we embarked upon, an exercise that would not simply count the ballots in the box, but would determine whether there was a credible process that caused those ballots to be there, and whether in fact all of those ballots should finally be considered in a count based on the validity which would be determined by that kind of reconciliation to which I referred earlier. And so that's what we embarked upon. There were those who, at the very inception, sought to indicate that we couldn't do what we wanted to do because there is Section 163 of the Article 163 of the Constitution that specifies that if there are problems with elections, and these problems should be dealt with a petition. But my own disposition is that if one reads carefully 163, one would see that 163 speaks to matters being brought to the fore after a declaration. And we were at the point where we had not yet made a declaration. So we were still in the course of an election.
The process.
Right? And what we were doing was using 162, using Section 22 to finalize the election, which had run into some issues based on the call for recounts, based on the furore in Region 4, and things like that. And so 163 was not going to kick in, because that only kicks in after a declaration, and we had not yet gotten to a declaration. And 162 provided us with the basis, along with Section 22, to address issues that may have arisen. And issues did arise, and we were seeking to sort those issues out, and we specifically drafted an order to do so. And one cannot juxtapose the order to the Constitution, because for all intents and purposes, that order is itself anchored in the Constitution insofar as the order was in response to provisions of the Constitution and provisions of the Elections Laws Amendment Act. So the order wasn't out there on its own. The order is anchored in the highest law, the Constitution, and subsequently in the specific law that deals with elections matters. And therefore, for all intents and purposes, the order is as if you were following provisions of the Constitution.
I want to tell our viewers that I'm opening the line in 2 minutes because I know our time is not so long on this program. It goes so fast. But that is an interesting outline there, Vincent. I think the public out there over time has become aware of the strength of that order in relation to the recount. But it seems to me as though the opposition leadership seem to be harping on just the numerical count and not taking into account those variables that you have just outlined. I think is as a result of that particular thought process that led them to say, look, after the ruling of the appellate court, that they moved to the CCJ. That's an area now that is generating a lot of discussion and comments and views, not just in Guyana, but in the wider world.
I think the position is unfortunate because given what I outlined in terms of the order, when we went through the actual process, it was determined that there were a number of things that were irregular.
Well, I remember the chairman did say there are serious
There were a number of
allegations.
things that were irregular. For example, there were many instances where people voted ostensibly using certificates of employment, but there is no evidence of the certificate itself. So the question is that a valid vote? And this is irrefutable. There are instances where people ostensibly voted with oaths of identity, but there are no such
Evidence.
evidence. And this again is irrefutable. There were instances where the APNU AFC eventually provided documentation to show that there were people who were dead, who were voted for, and their certificates were provided to that effect. So again, this is irrefutable. And there were instances where the APNU AFC provided information of people who had migrated and not been in the country at the time, and who were voted for. So there were real issues which arose during the process of the recount. Now, there has been a comeback in the public domain that we have found people who were supposed to have been voted for, but they were in Guyana. And there's been that comeback. And my own disposition is that the public domain is not the place where that matter is solved. If there is evidence that the report which was provided by the authorized body, that is the chief immigration officer, showing that people are out of the country is not correct, then there are official fora where that matter should be interrogated. But just to go into the propaganda realm and then to claim that based on that what has been provided is inaccurate doesn't suffice. And so for the time being we have to deal with the official documentation, and that documentation does support and is a source of evidence that there were people who had died who voted and people who migrated who voted. So we came out of the recount process with tremendous question marks as to the credibility of the elections process. And in fact, the order specified that what we were seeking to do was to get a final, credible count.
Okay. Morning, you're on the air.
Good morning, gentlemen.
Morning, morning.
I'm just calling to find out what is the reason to make the joint services ballot is stamped. If the opposition has the intention of importing police and soldiers to the country, so that just anticipate no, why is the ballot stamped or stamped?
I happen to be a commissioner of the Guyana Elections.
Yeah, you're hearing us?
I happen to be a commissioner of the Guyana Elections Commission.
I listen to the ear.
And that
Okay.
matter of the joint services was brought to our attention. When that matter was brought to our attention, we sought to propose 3 scenarios in relation to ballots which weren't stamped. It is true that there were ballots which were not stamped. That is true. It is true that there were instances where ballots were intermixed. In other words, where joint services ballots were intermixed, that there were ballots which were not stamped. But we were not able to specify that those ballots were joint services ballots. So as a commissioner, I want to make it pellucid that yes, there were ballots which were unstamped, but that the commission did not come to a conclusion that those were specifically joint services ballots. And when one looks at the totality of joint services ballots, which are somewhere in the vicinity of 8,000 ballots, and the totality of unstamped ballots, the number of unstamped ballots is significantly less than the totality of joint services ballots. So I don't think the public should run away with the position that joint services ballots specifically were not stamped. We do have issues with unstamped ballots, which I don't think we've dealt with properly. For example, there are somewhere in the vicinity of 189 unstamped ballots, 81 of which are in Sophia, and 108 are on the East Coast. And if one looks at those unstamped ballots, one could see clearly there's a clerical error where rather than folding the ballot vertically, the ballot was folded horizontally.
Oh.
So the double stamp fell on the regional part rather than one on the general and one on the regional. And so it was clear that there was error. And in the case of Sophia, it was even recorded by the presiding officer that she observed this error being made by the AP, with the assistant presiding officer, and corrected it. So only 81 ballots were affected. But yet, GCOM held out that the law says unstamped ballots are not to be counted. And I think that that is a miscarriage of the law, because any law has a reason for its existence. And in legal interpretation, it says you must identify the mischief the law was intended to deal with. The mischief is intended to be that you can't have a ballot that didn't pass through the official process. So people can't throw in ballots that didn't come at the time of poll.
Okay.
Here is an instance where it is verified that these ballots came from the official process.
But inadvertently.
But there was administrative problems. And still, GCOM did not accommodate those ballots. So I think in that regard, we do have a situation where we came out of the recount with valid ballots, 189. And this has nothing to do with which party they're for. Valid ballots not having been counted.
Oh, missed that call just now. Anyway, I'm sorry, I missed your call, sir. But you can call us back. Yes, I remember that instance because I worked in the Sophia Primary School, and I think that incident occurred at the nursery school. Yeah. Morning, on here.
Good morning to you, gentlemen.
Yeah, morning.
I have been a member of the People's National Congress, a lifelong member.
That's good to know.
I have worked as a guy in the government with Lyndon Forbes Sampson Burnham, the late Lyndon Forbes Sampson Burnham, the best ever until now. And becoming a member of the PNC, I did not do it on the basis of racism, because I can't. In the first place, it would be stupid of me. Okay, now coming to the election, this last election.
Yes.
I've worked 2015, I did my best, and I have to praise you what I have to say. Now, we have been conducting an elections drama. Now, let me praise it.
Yeah, please.
115,000 votes are invalid. It simply says that we worked against our own party. I have listened carefully, and I'm not a school dropout. I'm not a semi-illiterate. I have listened carefully, and I know, and I can hold a Bible, I can hold a Quran, I can hold a Bhagavad Gita and say Lyndon Forbes Sampson Burnham would have never done it. When I said done it, drag this thing all the time out, and we are getting poorer.
All right, thanks for your comment.
No, I'm not finished yet.
Okay.
I need Mr. Granger to come out and concede, because if it had happened in Lyndon Forbes Sampson Burnham time, he would have known that he didn't win. We did what we had to do, but we haven't succeeded because he was the best. He did for us what he should have done for us. So we succeeded at that time. But this time, the Creator, we understand spirituality. So we know all this rhetoric trying to cover up things.
All right.
No. Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks for your views. Okay, thank you.
I'm not quite sure I understand the logical sequence of what the caller said, but the callers expressed a view that has nothing to do with what I have been specifically
That's right. That's right.
referring to.
She has an opinion in relation to the results of the election. Essentially,
Well,
that's what
no results have been declared as yet.
well, her results. She has
She has
an opinion in
no
relation
results have been declared
to the
as
results,
yet.
and that's one of
As
the
I
things.
see it, we have a situation where we do have numbers, but we do have the big question mark about the credibility of those numbers.
Morning, you're on the air.
Good morning.
Morning.
I'd like to know if the CCJ really have anything that they could do with this thing here, because I don't trust the CCJ because Marajabio liar is Mendes, and the CCJ won't want Mendes look little in Trinidad, so they can give you all the case to win. So maybe even this CCJ thing, we should come up with this CCJ thing, because if we're supposed to be independent country, it seems to me like in 1966 we didn't get independence, we get dependent. we depending from people, we supposed to depend for nobody. We could make a decision that's not supposed to be it. That is the highest code. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you for calling. I just wish to
There are lots of emotions that are being revealed in this process. Unfortunately, lots of emotions. Ghana exercised its sovereignty and its independence when it took a decision in the first instance to withdraw from the Privy Council. That was us exercising our sovereignty and our independence.
Right.
We further exercised the same sovereignty and the same independence when we joined the CCJ. And therefore, we have to live with the fact that the CCJ is not an imposition of Guyana. Guyana joined using its independence and sovereignty through an act of its parliament, the CCJ. I think the question that we have to face here is a legal question, which I will not attempt to answer. And that is whether in this specific instance, the CCJ has jurisdiction. That's a legal question. And that legal question will be determined because it is before the CCJ now to be determined and will be determined.
I like your comment on that. But like you rightly said, our sovereignty has been exercised when we decided to exit ourselves from the Privy Council and get into the CCJ. But that is a very significant thing because Forbes Burnham felt, and it's as a result of his views on the regional integration movement and the role that these member states are to play in terms of advancing the cause of the Caribbean people, inclusive of Guyana, that he took that kind of position because same reason why he exited himself from the Privy Council. So we should be very careful when we perhaps people make these kind of comments because Forbes Burnham, one of the reasons why, I remember this program we had it, why we have the secretariat, the CARICOM secretariat in Guyana, was disclosed at one of the heads of government conference where they all said that it's as a result of the work that was done by Forbes Burnham in bringing this whole thing together. Why the headquarters of CARICOM is situated in Guyana.
In fact, there were a few who were suggesting it shouldn't be in Guyana, and Eric Williams made it very, very clear that given the role that Guyana and Burnham had played from Carif to coming right forward, that Guyana was the place for the Secretariat to be located. We had played a significant role in the establishment of CARICOM, and thought that here is where the Secretariat should
And it's
be.
written in the Treaty of Chagaramas.
Right.
So it's not a case where we can just exit ourselves from CARICOM. Morning, you're on the air.
Yes, good morning.
Morning.
Clayton all this fighting down. That's what we went through. You know, with all this burning and fighting and killing, we don't want that anymore. We want love in this country.
Okay.
We want understanding and love. Indians, black people live like brothers and sisters. When I was falling in the country, everybody was auntie and uncle.
That's
Why
right.
can't we get this still? Why he is fighting to go back in and cannot make this country peaceful and happy? Why the fighting is that this thing comes to an end? We are getting sick. We just sick. The COVID got me sick, and this thing that's going on, fighting and you know it was fraud. Fraud is fraud.
Well, I agree with you there.
Telegram people vote this body boxing got him nothing and it's fraud. It's fraud. Good
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for
What I
calling.
would say is that the Burnham Foundation agrees with you, and that is why we are saying the issue is not merely an issue of elections. Because even though, as you said, everybody was friend and so forth, when it came to elections, we saw a particular divide occurring. And so there's need for this thing to come to an end, but it need to be brought to an end by a conversation that takes us beyond this continued spiking of our sickness at elections into the creation of a system that is more accommodating of the realities of our plurality, and that will allow us to be able consciously to work together.
Morning on here. Morning. I miss you again. You can call back at this time. I certainly agree with your comments there, Vincent, in relation to the need for us to have the conversation. Because we cannot kind of continue along this path that every time there's an election we have this kind of problem. Morning, you're on the air.
Good morning.
Morning.
Good morning.
Good to you and Ms. Alexander.
Yes.
Here, me looking after CCJ. I looking after we court. Court is final.
Yes.
And when they done with the crop, the force, I hope you actually President Granger. Because thing will be nice.
Okay.
Our court said it, the man must use valid vote. He use it. President Granger must swear in. I don't concern with PPP and no CCJ. They could really run to the court in hell and all. I don't concern. It's President Granger is the winner. You all
Okay.
have a blessed day.
Thanks for calling, my dear. All right.
I'm not going to get involved in the argumentation about the winners. Suffice to say that the CCJ is also our court. And
Yes.
we have to understand that. If we don't want it to be our court, then we could withdraw. But for the time being, the people of Guyana, through their representatives, without any dissenting voice, in 2004, I think it was, decided that the CCJ will be our final court. So it is our court.
Morning, you're on the air. And I see our time is fast running out. I can accommodate 2 more calls, I think, at this point in time before we take our exit. Morning, you're on the air. Morning. Morning, you're on the air. Hello? Let's see, call. Yeah, this one. Yeah, the CCJ, like you rightly said, it's our final court, having exited the Privy Council. But like you rightly said, we have to. Morning on here.
Good morning, Mr. Alexander.
Good morning.
You're the gentleman. We are not saying that the CCJ is not the final, but within this election context, where it is clearly shown in our laws that our appellate court has ruled that it is final, it is there, we have seen it with our own eyes.
That's right, I agree.
Pardon me?
Yes, I agree with you. I saw it myself.
Right. So therefore, to my mind, and others like myself, after all, we're not fools out here, you know. You're not fools. This should be settled here and not in that court. Yes, it is our final way of getting justice, but where this is concerned with our constitution,
Okay.
when we are working with our constitution of valid votes, which means that all the documentation should be there to qualify the votes, etc., etc. This is what we are dealing with. We don't want anybody or anything to hinder our progress of quality.
Okay.
We want a government that will be for the people, for Guyana, for everyone to benefit.
Okay.
We don't want any foreign body to be into our politics, to be talking so much trash. We have had enough of that. This is our thing here, and because of discrepancies and unscrupulous people, we are at this position in this country.
Okay.
It's time we get rid of all that nonsense and get it right. Have a blessed day.
Thanks for calling.
Thanks to you. You've
Yeah.
raised 2 issues. I am quite sure that we want the best of government. That is not an issue in dispute. The CCJ has itself said that the question of whether they have jurisdiction has
to be
not been determined. They have not said that they have jurisdiction. And so we have to allow the law to run its course. This matter, I'm made to understand, will come up on Wednesday, and the CCJ will listen to the arguments of the various sides, and within its own jurisdiction as our court, will be the final determinant as to whether or not it has jurisdiction. The matter is not a determined matter. We have put ourselves into a system,
Morning.
and we have to allow it to run its course.
Hello?
Please turn on your radio. Please turn on your television if you have it on.
Okay.
Because this is our last call. You got to be a little quick with this
I'm
one.
going to be quick.
Yeah.
I know that the topic is about election, right?
Yeah.
But I would like to deviate a little bit if you would allow me.
Yeah, please. You got to make it snappy.
Right? This whole thing that the people fighting about this election is nothing concerning this election. The whole topic and the whole stuff that is going on now is about the change of government in Venezuela. They approached Granger and he said he don't want them to come in here, and they decided to bring his government down. And that's it. The international community and the Americans. Poor Jackie, he got caught between a rock and a place because they got papers on him. So he got to go along with what he's saying. And this is all I got to say.
All right, thanks for calling. And you're our last caller. I want to, at this point, say thanks for all of you who have joined me on this program today, where we have been looking at the question of elections. Of course, early on, I expressed sincere condolences to a colleague of mine who has departed, and I would like to tell you also, from what I've learned from the chairman, Mr. Alexander, we will be having another program to commemorate the life of Eustace Hall, better known as Reggie Hall, sometime later on. I know he'll be buried on Monday, and those of you who have contributed in relation to your views in relation to our elections impasse currently, I want to thank you for your views, and I hope that the views expressed and the information that has been passed on by Commissioner Alexander will be of help to you in understanding where we are at and how we are where we are. My name is Clayton Hinds, and I want to thank you for listening, having me in your kitchen and your living room from this time until the next time, next month, when I see you on the 4th Sunday of July.